Welcome to Global Unity Radio. I'm Elliot Bayev. In future episodes, we will dig more deeply into what Global Unity is, the vision, the mission, and how you can participate. But in this episode, we feature an incredible changemaker, Helene Papper, who is a UN leader, peace and security specialist, humanitarian and development expert, global communicator and advocate, and former international journalist. Helen is the Director of Global Communications and Advocacy at IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, an international financial institution and specialized United Nations agency. This conversation took place on the audio app Clubhouse in one of the Global Unity Club rooms, System Changer Spotlight. Global Unity runs a number of rooms on Clubhouse, from decentralized governance to Changemakers United, to Society OS, and, as we'll hear today, System Changer Spotlight. System Changer Spotlight is a room where we feature a real standout changemaker like Helen, who has made a great impact through dedicating their lives to making a difference. I was instantly taken with her story as soon as I heard about her work using radio throughout Africa to turn child soldiers into journalists. So I think you'll enjoy hearing her story. I certainly did. The folks in the room certainly did as well. Before we dive in, I invite you to go to globalunity.org, where you can sign up for our mailing list and learn more about Global Unity and the mission, vision, and folks that we are working with. With that said, enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to System Changer Spotlight. This is an evolution of the room that Taylor and I have been running, but not every amazing person we want to hear from focuses exclusively on decentralized governance. And so System Changer Spotlight is a chance for us to spotlight some folks. We're all really taken with change makers of all stripes, but then there are a few folks where you hear their story and you're just really blown away. And that was my experience hearing a bit of Helen's story. And I wanted everyone to be able to hear from her, hear her experience and her perspectives, which again have been pretty impactful for me. And so we're going to jump right in. First off, just to introduce Helen briefly, she is, as we'll hear, she's got a background in journalism and peacekeeping and now diplomacy. She's director at IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development at the United Nations, and has an incredible wealth of experience in the field. And we'll hear more from Helen on what her current focus is. But Helen, I wanted to actually start at the beginning, so to speak. Sounds like your international adventures didn't start in adulthood, but actually earlier on in life. Can you tell us a little bit about how that played a role in your childhood?
Sure. Well, I am French citizen, even though many times I'm told I don't sound like one. I was born in Spain. My dad was a teacher, primary school teacher, but in international schools, and so that's why we were traveling. I was born in Spain, and then I moved to the U.S. when I was 5 years old, and then went back to Europe and to France for the first time when I was 11. And was in Germany for a bit, and then I was in theater, and I was actually involved in a theater company in Boston. So I moved around quite a bit until I went to college, and I went to college in the U.S., and that's where I began my whole career.
How did you get started thinking about impact?
I was already really engaged in storytelling through theater, and so I always really was interested in telling stories. And because I traveled and because I was in international contexts, I think that really opened me up to the idea of communicating and of talking about what I had lived in one country versus another. There's the linguistic context as well, but really, I think what started really getting me to think about the impact of storytelling and the importance of actually using stories and using storytelling to move the world closer together in some ways was in my first experience with radio. So I got into radio because I went to Syracuse University in upstate New York, and one day we had a guy who was running the local national public radio in Syracuse who came in and auditioned us, and he ended up selecting me and coaching me, and he really launched me on this path to journalism, which led me then to the rest of my career. But one of the first stories that I covered was there were a lot of tensions in upstate New York with indigenous smoke shops, and the whole taxation around that and the land rights. And he told me to go up and do a story on it. And I really knew nothing about indigenous peoples except what I had seen through comic books. And I had been a big fan of Tintin for since I was a little kid. And I don't know if some of you know what Tintin is, but Tintin is the story of this young man who's traveling the world as an international reporter, and he gets involved in all of these stories and conflicts. And it's definitely old compared to to what it is today. But there was a specific comic book on Tintin Goes to America, and it was a very specific construct of indigenous people, which is the Indians with the feathers in their hair and the teepees and smoking their pipes, and that was the idea that I had, which was obviously when I traveled and I went to meet this indigenous tribal chief, and the community had nothing to do with what I'd seen in these comic strips and these comic books. And he met me. He was a wonderful man who met me in a building, sitting in a normal area, and what I considered completely different than what I had expected. It wasn't the teepee, and when I think about it, it's ridiculous, right? What I had in my mind, but those were the images that I had seen, and that's when I realized that we don't know about others until we actually meet them. We don't know about others until we have the possibility to create that connection. And I realized that the power that I had to be able to tell these stories was to deconstruct these false constructions that are actually can lead to terribly damaging situations, right? I think a lot of what we see today, up until today, hate, racism, conflicts, war, a lot of it stems from the lack of knowing the other, the misinformation that we've been exposed to, for good or for bad. But the misinformation is usually not a positive one. And the world is evolved tremendously, right? So because of technology, we now have a lot more access to a lot more reality than we used to once upon a time. But that's really that story that got me into this idea of using communication and using information rather as a way to deconstruct these false constructions, and using it as a way to get them to tell their story. And I really very quickly got into a specific style. Yeah. So I started with. I was really lucky, because I went through this training and this journalism experience in college. A while, before I graduated, I was already pretty much a full-time journalist for WAR in Syracuse, and I started applying for jobs and was hired immediately. So I did, I did one internship at Voice of America in Washington, D.C., which was probably my first exposure to do international news. And of course, really enjoyed that. And then ended up getting a job immediately out of college in Oklahoma, which was an interesting choice because I had quite a few offers. And I decided to go to Oklahoma because I thought, okay, at the time, I thought I'm going to be a journalist in the United States and I'm going to stay in the United States. And in parentheses here, I'm not American, right? So actually, the station had to request a specific visa for me, which was an H-1B visa at the time. And they did make the case of why they were hiring me on, and I thought, if I'm going to become a journalist covering the United States, I need to know all of the United States and not just the East Coast and what I had been exposed to. So I was quite enchanted to get this job in Norman, Oklahoma, out of all places, where I actually ended up doing a lot more stories on indigenous populations in that particular construct, but also really developed a program called Oklahoma Voices. So I was the morning edition presenter for the local station, which was called KROU, and I presented morning edition, and at the same time I developed a program, Oklahoma Voices, and the idea was to continue on this path of bringing voices together. And for those of you who know the context of Oklahoma there are a lot of tensions based on misinformation, miscommunications, tensions with indigenous communities, terrible racism. And the idea was to really start bringing voices together and confront this misinformation to reduce potential conflict and hatred in the area. And so I really quickly got onto that kind of path. And then that led me to take a job. I didn't stay very long because I had the opportunity to take another position in Iowa City, or Muscatine, Iowa, rather. But it was actually for a program on international diplomacy. And that put me on the international path, definitely, called Common Ground. And as you hear from the word, common ground means what it is. It was about bringing communities and international voices, international contexts, international conflict into radio programs for that were going out on National Public Radio. So that's kind of what led me onto this path.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And how did the transition from journalism to peacekeeping unfold?
Well, that was quite later on, because from Iowa, I ended up not having my visa renewed, and I had to go back to France. And when I got to France, I hadn't had my career there. I hadn't launched my career. I hadn't worked in France professionally. Neither had I studied in French in terms of journalism. And so when I got to France and I realized, well, I am French, but I don't know how to go continue in my field because I didn't have the linguistic constructs to do that. Neither did I have really any type of basis to go and work for a French station. And so for quite a while, I didn't really know what to do anymore. I ended up teaching English and completely leaving journalism behind for a while, and really enjoyed this part of my life of teaching, and teaching English to adults. And a friend of mine one day who I had gone to college with, who contacted me, and he had entered the UN, and he was a UN volunteer based in Kosovo. And one day he contacted me and he said, "What are you doing teaching English? You're a journalist. You were really good at what you were doing. You were already starting to interview, world leaders." And it's true. I had, while I was based in Iowa, I had already started doing international reporting. I had, my first international story was from Gaza and from Israel. That was, before I left the U.S. And I had done a whole series of stories on these communities that had closed themselves and walled themselves in to avoid, racial divides and religious divides. And we're really working on a new construct of society within their walls across Israel. So that was a really interesting story to cover. So, he mentioned that, and he said, you can't leave that behind. And I had also gotten to do a story on Iran with Walter Cronkite. And for those of you who may have known of Walter Cronkite, he was a very, very famous broadcaster and journalist in the United States. And I had done a whole series on polio across Africa, and had been in touch also with Jimmy Carter and his foundation, and interviewed Jimmy Carter. That was the first, major kind of presidential interview that I got to do. So, fast forward that, he was reminding me of these stories, and he said, I really want you to come and cover what is happening in Kosovo. It was in 2002, in December, January, I believe, and it was at a time where Kosovo was just coming out of a very intense conflict, and there was a lot of issues with the return of communities back to their original towns and lands. The Serbians and the Albanians and the Roms, what were called the Roms, the Ashkeli, and he sent me a plane ticket, and I ended up landing in Kosovo in the dead of winter. It was a very difficult arrival because we couldn't actually enter Kosovo, so I had to land in Macedonia, I think it was, and a taxi drove me to the border, but he couldn't take me in, and I had to actually walk across through the snow to get to the other side, to get into Kosovo, which was a very difficult. It was a challenging time because it was difficult to get into Kosovo, and there were a lot of tensions, and it really just put me into this world of barely getting out of conflict, and a lot of community tensions and a lot of difficulties, and you could feel it. And when I arrived where he was based, and he was, as I said, a UN volunteer at the time in a community called Strepse, which was Serbian, and you could just feel it. And I was looking, and I knew about the conflict, and I knew how people had been involved and the brutality of the conflicts that had happened in the area, and you could just feel it in the air. And at the same time, I started really getting to know people, getting to know their stories, getting involved with this necessity to go back to their own identities and their attachment to their communities, their attachment to their lands, and at the same time having to heal from the conflict. And it was probably one of the most impactful, I think, ways of starting this whole career path. I followed a family, for instance, who was being brought back to their house, to their home, an Albanian family in the Serbian community, and there had been a lot of interviews done by international organizations to make sure that the community was ready to receive them and that they could come back without fearing violence. And I followed them into this return. And the next day when I came to see how they were doing, they had been killed. And that really got to, even today, I still get tears, because these were children. This was, and I thought, where is that violence that comes from this seeking of identity? How do you get to the point of being able to kill little children, a baby, a family trying to come back to their home? But at the same time, I realized the importance of being able to know the stories of the people, all the people, right? And not judge. Yes, it's very easy to go into, how could they, and therefore they are bad, but it's very important to actually go behind that. What leads to this violence, whether it's from one community or another. And that's really what got me into developing stories in this area. And I ended up, launching, selling stories as an independent reporter for the first time, and understanding also how to sell these stories, which was very new to me because I'd never done that, and becoming an international correspondent by selling my stories to Deutsche Welle and then being picked up by the BBC and NPR and so on and so forth. And so that was also my first introduction to the UN and to the work that they did on the ground, and to understanding what they were doing in this particular context, and how they were working with the different forces on the ground, how they were recreating institutions to be able to create a united Kosovo. It was quite fascinating, and from that story, I ended up doing another story which I think impacted me a lot, which was on the trade of prostitution coming into Kosovo. When I was in Mitrovica at the border with Serbia, And I was doing a story on the peace train. This peace train was a train that traveled all through the country and that was connecting the different regions, the Serbian, the Albanian regions, and so on. What really shocked me about the train was that the wagons were separate based on if you were Serbian or if you were Albanian. And the fact that we were on that train really alarmed certain people. We had a translator with us who was Albanian, and we were sitting on a Serbian train, and the security that was moving around was telling us how dangerous it was for us to go up to Mitrovica with this particular translator. But he knew where we were going, and he understood. But he did end up having to get off. The security wouldn't let him go into the heart of Mitrovica, and he ended up having to get off before we went into the Serbian enclave. And when we were after going around Mitrovica, and that's a very long story, but after going around, we were waiting for the train to go back, and I saw coffins being loaded in, and I saw one of the tops of the coffin being lifted up, and it was a woman who was rising up to get some air. And I started asking around what this was about, and they were saying this is how they bring women and prostitution into this area, and the prostitution that was tied to an area where there were a lot of armed forces, and prostitution was a common trade, unfortunately. And I ended up doing a whole story. Again, it would be a very long story to tell here, but a whole story following these women who were being transported into coffins into the country to serve as prostitutes in different areas, in different hotels. And it was a very difficult story, and a very harrowing one, because then that got me into looking at human trade and human trafficking, and the link between that and the economies and weapons trades and violence, and what fuels violence, and all the constructs that come into these situations. That's what really got me into my career of getting those voices of the most vulnerable and the often overlooked communities.
Mm-hmm. Must have been such a harrowing time seeing all this happen. I'm wondering, what gave you the fortitude to keep going? Or did you have, when you saw the real danger and you saw these things happen, did you have questions about stepping away?
Sure. It wasn't easy. I wasn't even sure how legitimate I was to tell these stories. I was in my early 20s. I had started. I think it's different today, where you see people studying much later, and then they go through many internships and so on and so forth. But I, my career started very young, and so I was in very, very early 20s. I graduated early from college, and so I had started this. I was 22, I think 23 when I was doing these stories. So it was challenging, and I was wondering, am I doing this right? Am I telling the story right? Is my voice going to make a difference? And it was very hard to see. And so at the same time, I wanted to continue this, and at the same time, I was also trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to move forward? What stories am I going to go cover? But a lot of this I ended up, of course, through this, meeting people who, I met somebody, I met a photographer who was working and also reporting on this situations in Kosovo. And by following him, at one point he invited me to follow him, and we ended up going to Iraq. And at the time that I was in Kosovo, I was already seeing K4 trucks. So these were the UN vehicles that were leaving. And we were realizing that they were actually already being moved to Iraq. So it was a very particular time. And then I ended up in following him through a very long type of story as well, and a long trip to end up in Baghdad at a time where conflict was ensuing there, and where I ended up kind of being left alone because he was very busy doing his photography, and because of the conflict and because of the bombing that was taking place there, we ended up being separated. And I realized that I was not prepared for this, and not really there with a whole construct to be able to tell stories. I did end up doing reporting live from there, but I also ended up going back through contacts I made on the ground with French forces, who ended up letting me, travel back with them to France. It was a point where I was wondering, okay, do I want to do this? This is where I saw danger. This is where I saw bombings. This is where I was in the heart of violence, and didn't quite know if I was equipped yet to be able to be in these situations without the connections, or without being sent by a real network, and just being there by myself. And so I did go back to Paris, and then I started working from Paris, and I got jobs, here and there. And this is where I started working for Radio France International. This is where I started also on a project on building a radio station in Paris for the English language community. So that was very different than the international correspondence and the war reporting. And so, for the next few years, I did a lot of different things. I worked for Radio France. I worked for French TV as a journalist, and as a host, and as a reporter. And I was getting jobs, where they were, because I also needed to make a living. And journalism, despite what people may think sometimes, is not a terribly well-paid profession, but you do it out of passion. Unless you're a star reporter for Star Television. But when you're a foreign correspondent, you really have to balance the stories and at the same time making ends meet. I was living out of my grandmother's little room that she allowed me to stay in an apartment in Paris. And I was flying in and out, covering stories. And at the same time, I was doing these different jobs. I was working a lot. I can tell you that. Working a lot, meaning that I was the morning news presenter for IFI, and then I was starting up this radio station, and then I would fly out to cover a story, on an international story that I was being paid to do, and then would come back. And so it was an interesting path. And and at the same time, at that point, and I'm afraid to weave too many things into here, but technology was just changing. This was, 2000, so we're talking about 2003, 2004, 2005, where at the time, there was just brewing the concept of communication through the internet, of radio through the web, of video was barely, the idea of putting video on the web was something that was extremely new, very costly when it came to streaming, and something that was barely starting. And when I started this project of the radio station for the English language radio station in Paris, which was called Paris Live Radio, at the very beginning, when we were shopping this around, people were saying, "What, radio on the web? Are you crazy? That's never going to work. Video on the web." And I started from that. I started a production company called Media's Pick, and I brought a lot of the concepts that I was learning through these different storytelling techniques, and through my travels and through the reporting, to really create a new way of thinking about how we communicate and how we use, for companies, for tourism, and so on. The fact that it was extremely important that when communication or information was going out, that it was adapted to target audiences, that if you were communicating for a French audience, there's a specific way of editing your story and of telling your story that is different than what the American expectation is, or that the Indian expectation is, or that the expectation in Japan or in Indonesia. And I started realizing, the constructs, the phrasing, the pace of images, the colors are different. And so I was able to get a team of international journalists together to start creating this company called MediaSpic. And that was focused on tourism on one hand, and on institutional corporations on the other. And this was starting to go really well. I got an award for the youngest, innovative creator in Paris at the time. But all of this wasn't making that much money. And at the same time, I really wanted to figure out how to start my company. And I had applied for jobs here and there on the web. And one night I got a call out of the blue from Haiti. My father calls me and says, somebody from Haiti is trying to call you. And I said, who from Haiti? Something about the UN. And I said, no, I don't know what that's about. And I had actually applied, but didn't realize it, on a website called Galaxy at the time. And so I ended up having this guy call me on the phone, who was doing the final recruitment for a radio producer in Haiti for the UN peacekeeping operation. And the recruitment processes today at the UN have nothing to do with what it was. But he interviewed, he said, are you available for an interview? And he just interviewed me. And he said, you're the best candidate for this position. Do you want to join the UN? And I really didn't understand what this really meant. But I was so desperate to figure out a way to make, real money at the time, to then, in my mind, continue my company that I'd started, this MediaSpic, that I accepted. And within a few weeks, I had a contract. And within a few weeks after that, here I was going to training for my first peacekeeping operation. And this was in my mid-20s. And ended up going to Brindisi, which was a logistics base, which is where they trained people who were onboarding into peacekeeping. And that just kind of completely changed my world, of course. Not to mention just the entire, being introduced to what the UN was, being introduced to peacekeeping, going through trainings and proper trainings on conflict zones, going through trainings where you're being kidnapped, where you're being asked to go through a lot of different potential contexts to see how you would react, and being trained on those specifics, doing a lot of physical training as well, and wearing a bulletproof, the UN bulletproof jackets, which are much heavier than the ones that we have as journalists, and so on. And from there, I landed in Haiti. And that was the beginning of my peacekeeping experience. Haiti was an extremely impactful area as well. That was devastated by poverty, but at the same time that had this amazing vibrance and culture and people that transcended me. And I did come into Haiti to start the beginnings of building a radio station to accompany the democratic processes that was ensuing in the electoral process, which would end up seeing the election of René Préval. And that was an incredible experience. I traveled Haiti, I recruited Haitians to start working on this radio station with me, but we didn't have a frequency, and there was a lot of lobbying to get a frequency at the highest levels of government. But since there were a lot of radios already, they didn't really understand why the UN needed a radio. And so that meant a lot of negotiations to say, yes, but this would be a space of protected space to create unity between the different areas and between the different regions. And as we were, going through that process, we were also covering the country. And I was in helicopters back and forth and working with the different peacekeeping military units that were there, and I ended up covering the Argentinian military and the Ecuadorian military. So, it's a long story, but that's really how I entered peacekeeping.
Mm-hmm. And tell us more about how long it took to set up these radio channels and stations, rather, and what was that process like? Not as much. I mean, it sounds like there were some governmental hurdles you had to get through, but culturally, it sounds like a UN station is a new concept or a new approach to using radio. How was it adopted? What were some of the challenges you had in setting that up?
So in Haiti, like I said, Haiti, I didn't stay long enough to actually see it through in terms of having the frequency. But we already had started negotiating spaces on national radio to be able to have specific programs to accompany this electoral process. And I started doing a lot of trainings on with journalists across the country on the importance of creating programs that were actually going to support populations in better understanding the particular processes, but also addressing some of the gaps that I heard on air, which was programs that really specifically talked to their needs, whether it was health, whether it was education, whether it was understanding what the international community was doing. And so I did start working with local journalists through these trainings on building these particular programs to really go back to the roots of information, because sometimes we forget, that information, the core roots of information is really to support people in building their lives in the way that they want to build it, and to understanding and to use that information to actually support them in moving forward. And so that was a very, very interesting process. Like I said, I ended up having to leave for a number of reasons, but it was a very intense period in Haiti. There were a lot of tensions. There were a lot of kidnappings at the time, and a lot of violence that was around. That was linked to poverty. That was linked to the lack of having a proper voice and a recognition. It was linked to different community tensions. It was linked to land rights a lot. So it was very eye-opening. Mm-hmm. And then my mother got sick, and I decided to leave. I also actually got quite sick in Haiti, and was going through treatment at the Argentinian military base and hospital, and then ended up going back to France and worked at France 24 at the setup of this international news network. So I left the UN for a while. When I left, people saying, you're crazy. People never leave the UN once they're in. And I didn't see it that way. Plus, I had still this concept of starting up or continuing to build this company that I'd started. So I ended up staying a little over a year in Haiti, and then went back to journalism for a while. For a few years, I ended up being an international correspondent and a foreign policy analyst, rather, at France 24, which was also, part of my learning experience and career path, because France 24 was what do you call it? A test trial, something new. The idea of having a television station that was going to air in 3, then 4 different languages at the same time, with a lack of understanding of what that really meant. It kicked off in French, English, and Arabic, and the people who were directing it thought that the stories could go out at the same time, in the same languages. But again, what I was saying before, the way that we tell a story, depending on your language and culture, is very different. So that evolved, and I did a lot of stories. And through that one, I think, the one main life-changing event that happened while I was back in journalism, which then linked to my UN career after that, back to my UN career, was having the opportunity to go and cover the Ecuador. I really wanted to go do stories in Ecuador. And why Ecuador? was because when I was in Haiti, I had met and worked with Ecuadorian peacekeepers, and one in particular who I wanted to see again. So when I arrived at France 24, I said, I really want to go do stories on Ecuador. And they're like, why? What's important about there? And at the time, the FARC, there was a lot of conflicts in the area related to the FARC, related to the kidnapping of Ingrid Betancourt. And through a lot of research, I ended up being able to convince them to go, to let me go to Ecuador, and where I started covering a specific story on the destruction of the Amazon by Texaco Chevron, which is another very impactful story, and at the same time starting to cover the whole story on the kidnapping of Ingrid Betancourt, linking that to and eventually getting an interview with the president of Ecuador, who was very, very difficult to speak to, Rafael Correa, where I got an exclusive interview with him, and very, got very much involved in the politics of Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela at the time. Ran into Hugo Chavez at the airport and was able to do an interview with him, and Uribe in Colombia. And so I really got very much involved. At the same time, it was extremely complex. And this is where you realize that information and politics are not always a very good mix. And that was a very challenging time because I got so deep into the story that I did have people trying to get to me, to trying to understand what information I had and didn't have. My apartment in Paris was ransacked while I was doing investigation on this. My friends' computers were taken, those who had been in my apartment, because during that whole time I was coming in and out. I was doing my investigations, and then I was coming back to Paris, and I was going back into the field. I learned a lot through this process, but at the same time it was extremely difficult, and ended up having to remove myself from this once Betancourt was released. And I decided to go back, to take a break from journalism. It was very difficult. It was very difficult to get the real stories out. Freedom of the press was really being questioned at the time, even in France, when the President Sarkozy was president. And I ended up applying for an ambassadorship program through Rotary to just go and do research. I was thinking, okay, I need a break from all of this, and I want to do research and further my thought process on communication as a tool for peace, information as a tool for peace, and the difference between both. And I ended up getting this World Peace Ambassadorship that led me to Berkeley, California, and I was extremely happy to have that opportunity. Just a few months later, though, as I was just getting my feet wet at Berkeley, doing research and starting to teach as well, I actually got a contract offer to go set up the radio station in South Sudan, or to expand the radio station that I had already started being set up. And this was through the UN. And I went through days of tearing my hair up, wondering whether I should leave the U.S. I had really wanted to come back to the U.S. for a very long time, and whether I should just go back into the UN, which I ended up doing. And I never regretted it. And so then I went to South Sudan, and that was the beginning of a whole new chapter in terms of setting up a radio station and what that meant.
First, I mean, wow, such a storied journey on the way there, kind of being in the UN, leaving back to journalism, experiencing, I mean, you shared a little more about some of the challenges in Ecuador around Chevron and some of how that all played out, but coming back into the UN, working in South Sudan, what year was this, and how did things unfold from there?
South Sudan was in 2009, if I remember correctly. It was the summer of 2009, or it was, yeah. Or 2008, actually, I think. So 2008. So I ended up going back. I ended up flying to Sudan. I went back to training, believe it or not, for the UN. because it was a separate mission. That no longer happens. Once you've done one training, you're done. But in this particular case, I did, because I had left the UN, I went back as a newbie, quote unquote, and so I went back to training. And from there, I ended up going to Khartoum. And Khartoum was a type of land that I had never seen before. It's the desert. It's the Sahara Desert. You can really feel it. You can feel the particular culture of North Africa in Khartoum, and it's the desert wind and the heat of the 40 degrees, but extremely dry, so that you feel that your skin is wrinkling within a few minutes of being outside, and at the same time the sound of the mosques, and it's an atmosphere. I think when you travel and you go into these different countries, it's the atmosphere of the land, the geography, the culture that really gets to you at first, right? And to understand that you're in a completely different reality, a completely different construct than where you may have come from before, and taking the time to really breathe this in, to look around you, to look at the people, to feel what this is all about, and it was at a very specific time where there was a call for unity. Sudan and South Sudan should, according to the government of the north of Sudan, should stay united, and yet the South was brewing with this want to create their own identity, to be recognized as a separate country, to be recognized through what they had been through. They had also undergone an intense civil war, had been persecuted in South Sudan by the Janjaweed militia, and for them, the South Sudanese, many saw the Northerners as their enemy, and you can't judge. This is where you can't say no, they are, or no, they aren't. What you have to you have to take a step back and see what the different constructs are. The radio station, which was called Radio Mariah, which means mirror, was set up to try to create this unity. The call for the mandate of the UN at the time was unity, and to bring populations together and to create these spaces for dialogue. It was very difficult. We couldn't get a frequency in the north, and so we had to broadcast through AM and not FM, which is a whole challenge in terms of satellite transmission. The people who were hired to become the journalists of the future of this radio, a lot of them were child soldiers. This venture was, this particular construct was built between the UN peacekeeping, under the UN peacekeeping flag, and an organization that worked very closely in terms of radio building, which is called Fondation Hirondelle, which is based in Lausanne in Switzerland, and with a very specific mandate of radio as a tool for peace. And so the training of child soldiers that had come from all of these different areas of the South and of the North, that was the main ambition. And the idea was to create a ripple effect through the youth of, you can have a future. You have been raised with weapons in your hands. You have been raised with guns, but you can put them down, and you can learn how to speak to each other. And through that, you will enable others to speak to each other. And we will construct and reconstruct what war has destroyed. And it was very difficult. It was challenging. It was challenging to work with people and the youth who had been through this, and to bring them together around a table, and to do trainings together, and to get over their own conflictual dynamics, which ignited every single day as we were trying to get them to go, to get over what they had seen and heard and what they had lived. Not to get over it, but to be able to move to another dimension where they learned about each other. They learned about really what is their construct of humanity, which is the need to be recognized, acknowledged, heard, the need to get up in the morning, the need to drink, the need to sleep, the need to be human, to protect your family, to protect your community, falling in love, falling out of love, the fighting, etc. So that's really, it was first and foremost building that construct within the construct of this radio station that was going to go on the air, and creating that possibility, and through that starting to create programs that address those very issues that we've just talked about. And the radio station little by little grew, and little by little started getting a recognition, an important recognition across Sudan. I was based in Juba in the south, and so Juba in and of itself was a very, very different reality. And South Sudan was a country that was barely, exposed to the rest of the world. Where when I arrived, there was one road that connected the airport to the presidential house or palace, if you want to call it. Other than that, there were no roads, concrete roads, I would say. People lived in tukuls, and it was a very, very different type of community than even the North was, which then, as I started living in the South Sudan and traveling in South Sudan, I started understanding this necessity to create a different type of construct, political construct in their own country. It was geographically completely different than the North, culturally completely different. There was the Arab North and then the Black South, which was also very different, and where they didn't recognize each other. And there was this call for to be recognized for their own identity. At the same time, South Sudan was full of many, many, many different identities, right? More than 70 different tribes within South Sudan who also had their conflictual stories and their conflictual past, which somehow was muted because of this common enemy in the north. But that wasn't going to last forever. However, during the particular time that I was there, when I was asked to expand the radio station from Juba to all 10 states to support the electoral process and eventually the referendum process, which would lead to secession of the South from the North and the constructs of a new country of South Sudan, it was clear that there was a lot of work that also needed to be done to address the tribal differences within South Sudan. And this is where I learned and tried to really insist within the international communities and the constructs that the importance of dialogue. The dialogue was really key to be able to potentially imagine peace. And I think that was not necessarily taken as much as it should have been. So yes, this radio station grew. Yes, we were able to eventually expand it to 10 different states, which was extremely challenging logistically to get in the equipment, to get in the material, to figure out how the material would and the broadcasting equipment would sustain the heat, to get engineers involved in creating these different types of containers to protect the equipment, and so on and so forth. Building a radio station it's not just the programming, it's also the logistics of it, securing the airwaves, securing the satellites so that they're not taken over by people who want to use these airwaves to be able to to create misinformation, which can lead to new conflicts. It's a tremendous responsibility. That's what I learned. The responsibility that it was.
You spoke offline about how radio was used for ill in Rwanda, and this was a mission to do the opposite and to use it to bring people together. You spoke about a song that was co-created. Could you tell us a bit about that before we go on?
The song was actually in Mali, so that was later on. But I think it'd be good to talk a little bit more about South Sudan. I think if you want before I get into the story on Mali, because that's a whole different another type of story and a different construct. But South Sudan was an experience where the importance, like I said, the importance of bringing voices together was extremely important and not necessarily signified enough. And actually, there ended up being, as you know, a civil war after independence in South Sudan. And one of the reasons that I believe that it came to be, and of course it's not only that, but at the time there was a lot of political anonymity between the different tribes that I had talked about, and the fact of bringing the radio station. This radio station was the only national radio station with a protected space, right, with ethical information to be able to address conflicts when conflicts were brewing across South Sudan. Because we had gained such a trust factor, people would call us and say, there's conflict in my area and this, and we would go there with microphone in hand and just have people sit down and talk about what the conflict was about to get them to put their weapons down. And this happened on a very regular basis. It was extremely important. At the same time, I had journalists sometimes who forgot about their responsibility and who they themselves, I had one journalist one day who actually was so upset about, what he was so concerned that the referendum wouldn't lead to secession, that he went on air and did the cry of war, a cry of war that hadn't been heard since the signing of the peace agreements. And people immediately went in the streets and started looting, and people got scared because that created fear. And so that is how quick a conflict starts. And this is what I really want to, I think impress here, because this experience is about South Sudan. But I really want to say that the importance of this is actually, it mirrors our societies around the world. This is a very particular area that I'm talking about, but actually the capacity to use communication, information, the type of constructs that we are capable of using to ignite conflict, it's extremely quick. And so we have a responsibility when we speak. We have a responsibility when we have access to any type of communication and information. And we have a responsibility to make sure that the most diverse, people and voices are also given the possibility to speak and talk to each other, or else conflict then ensues. So there's a lot of things that happened during that time. But when the radio station was taken off air by the government by forces for those particular days, when really there was at the height of a new conflict, the conflict ensued very quickly. People, the rumors went very quickly about a new conflict brewing between different communities, and that was it. And it just went extremely quickly across the country. There had not been enough time to actually do this work on dialogue and reconciliation and getting over people's fears and so on and so forth. It went very quickly. And so for me, that lesson is the importance of not forgetting that.
Well, we're seeing today with communication channels, which are fairly sophisticated, being co-opted by, organizations like Cambridge Analytica, bringing polarization, how it might have a less overt impact or a less immediate impact. But hearing these stories show us the power of communication channels being co-opted to call for violence have a very direct impact, an immediate impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, to take a step back from the peacekeeping narrative and story that I'm telling you, I mean, I think this is definitely what I learned, but I think it's a lesson that we all need to understand and to try to promote, because today we have access to a lot of different areas, a lot of different platforms, to communicate, right? We have social media. Look at us in Clubhouse here talking. We have access to the different platforms and no more verification of information and communication. There's a blur now that's happened between communication and information. Information at the root, if the root base, like I said earlier, of information is to support people in decision making within their local community, within their region, within their country, within their life. Information needs to be verified and triple checked to make sure that actually people are getting verified information, right? Factually based information. Communication is much more, it's much broader. We're communicating. I'm telling you about my feelings. I'm telling you about what I think. I'm telling you things I'm coming from a personal point of view or an organizational point of view, but it's a very different type of construct than informing. And so that today, the fact that anyone from around the world has the possibility to have a voice, and it's not, again, I'm going to correct myself because there are still a lot of people who are left behind and who are not part of this and who don't have the possibility to have a voice. And I do think it's extremely important to ensure that people have a voice. So I'm not at all discouraging that and the amazing, progress we've made through technology. But with that progress comes responsibility. The responsibility of understanding when you have a voice, when you can communicate, when you can write, when you can cross boundaries through what you're expressing, that you need to be careful about what you're saying, because if it is misinformed or if it is linked to rumors, linked to hate, or linked to tension building, it can very much spiral out of control. And we saw this through the COVID pandemic. People were using networks of information to spread disinformation, which led to catastrophes in certain countries and in certain areas, led to people dying. And COVID is just an example, but this happens every day. It happens all the time. Technology is something that we still need to very much, all of us, think about where are the security barriers? With as much as it evolves with AI that's coming around and taking in a lot more space, where is the security to be able to address that without tampering freedom of speech? But at the same time, we do need to be very, very careful. And that's where I think education comes in. We need to start creating new educational constructs in schools with our youth, with our children, about the power of communication, about the power of having the freedom of speech, more so than ever before. Because I don't think that it's something that is necessarily it seems logical to us when we talk about it, but I don't think it's necessarily in the basic constructs. And it's extremely important to be able to explain how do we use that freedom of speech and voice that we have.
Well, now that everyone basically is a broadcaster, everyone who has access to social media, that becomes so much more vital. It's no longer centralized bodies, news stations, governments. It's now literally everyone, and everyone, and I'm seeing it in my own social feeds where folks are perpetuating not only misinformation, but as you're saying, communicating in a way that is almost stoking certain fires. And I like the framing that with this new power comes greater responsibility.
Yeah, it's absolutely that. And I think that's I think that we all need to understand it, but I think governments need to also, and I know that governments are doing a lot of work on this, and as well as international organizations. The UN launched a campaign that was called Verified that ended up being then turned into Pause. And the whole messaging behind it is, pause before you share. Look, triple source for information. Go and check what it's about before you go and share it on your networks. Understand the responsibility you have by creating that, by that click of share. We've seen it, and there's a lot of thinking, as you know, right now around these social platforms and the power that now Twitters and Facebooks and Instagrams have to potentially say not verified, or to actually ban somebody from participating on a platform. And this is where we're going into very risky territory. So where's the limit? How do you define what is shareable versus not shareable? What you define is the limit in terms of freedom of expression versus dangerous freedom of expression. It's very subjective in many ways, right? I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this whole thinking process evolves. But we all need to be part of that thinking process, that's for sure.
Well, it's these social platforms have created a new commons, but they're commons that are privately regulated. And so there's this disconnect between the governance of what have ostensibly become the collective platforms for information gathering and sharing, and what is not a collectively kind of chosen, even though we recognize there are problems with our electoral models and our governance structures. at least they're intended to represent the will of the people, whereas the CEO of Twitter is just the CEO of Twitter. And when Twitter becomes the default collective open space or cafe through which people share information, having it dominated by one body is it just increases these risks, especially as those in those positions may be the kindest, most altruistic people, but what happens when they get replaced in time, right? I'd love to hear a little more of how the efforts in Sudan played out and maybe move to Mali before we get into your current work.
Yeah, well, Sudan, I left South Sudan right after the referendum process. Actually, yeah, after the declaration after the independence, actually. So there was a referendum, and then there was the independence. It was in 2011, in July 2011, and I stayed until the end of that year and left. I had the opportunity I had spent almost 4 years. It was an amazing and probably some, I don't think I'll live through that type of intensity again, although I did in Mali, and I'll talk about that in a little while. But, I needed to take a little bit of a break. Also, personally, there were a lot of things happening in my life, and Juba and South Sudan. It's also, I'd gotten sick many times with malaria and typhoid, because the UN base was built on a marshland, and so it attracted a lot more mosquitoes than if we had lived in other areas. It eventually was moved and built on another site, but these are some of the things that sometimes when peacekeeping operations open up in a country, they're not necessarily looking at, or they don't have the possibility to have other spaces because the government really dictates where the base is going to be. And we know we shared the life within a compound in peacekeeping is very particular. We're all living together little by little. The containers come up. We were intense at first, and then containers in extremely challenging situations at times. I lived in a container and I'm talking about containers that, for those who don't know, they're like boat containers, with a little AC inside. And if your AC breaks down, you basically can't sleep there because it's in metal. And so the heat is so intense that you would pretty much fry. So you end up going outside, and at night there are mosquitoes that are more malaria mosquitoes. So I had malaria, I don't know how many times. In total, I think I've had it 10 times, but it was getting to be quite a lot. And the life there, you end up realizing that you're in your own bubble, right? There's a whole microcosm of the world in a peacekeeping operation, because people are we're all from different walks of life. We come from very different countries, and we're all working together with a purpose of either accompanying electoral processes or accompanying a peacekeeping process. And we all have to figure out a way to communicate with each other, get along, get over language barriers, cultural differences, and so on and so forth. It's a very intense type of living environment, which is actually why usually we have short rotations of 6 to 8 weeks, and then we go on vacation. And we have to go on vacation. It's not an option. We have to leave the country for at least a week or two, and then we come back. It enables people to also be able to breathe a little bit because it's so intense. You work 24 hours a day, basically, right? I mean, you live and work in your work. And you have shared bathrooms and shared situations. And a tidbit of information, it's only at the end that I realized that if I could convince the administration to let me build my own tiny bathroom next to my container, that maybe I could reduce the number of times I was getting malaria. And actually, from the time I did that, I did end up getting less malaria. But these are little facts that you learn while you're living in these particular constructs. And I ended up getting pregnant at the end of my time in Juba with my partner at the time, and I couldn't, continue living in South Sudan with the risk of malaria and wanting to start a family. And that's the very reality of when you're in peacekeeping and when you're in these kinds of lives, and at the same time you're thinking about the fact that you want to have a family, that, as a woman in particular, well, you get to the age where you're thinking, if I wait too long, it's not going to happen. And so it was a lot of thinking involved in that, because I was very much, I was very much dedicated to the work I was doing. And I also knew that starting a family would change my life in terms of the possibilities that I could then have in working in war zones and conflict zones. But it comes to be a point where you decide what your priorities are. So I ended up moving to Tunisia to work for the African Development Bank, and that's where I had my child. So that was an interesting moment of life. South Sudan, I always stayed very close to watching how things developed in South Sudan, what happened to the radio at the time. I told you that the conflict ignited again, and what the radio station is still doing today to be able to move on to the second phase of the evolution of the country, with the youth really still extremely hopeful of the future, for the future. And at the same time, it's very, very difficult. Refugee camps that you would have never imagined are there. The UN bases have been turned into refugee camps. Tensions are still very high. There's still a lot to be done in South Sudan in terms of development, and in terms of ensuring that communities have access to basic services and can go back on a path of construction and reconstruction of the future that they want. So that was one experience, a very, very poignant experience, which led me, like I said, I went to Tunisia for a while to work for the African Development Bank, and then I was actually hired back in by the person who had hired me for the radio station in South Sudan. He asked me to come back to Mali. He had moved to Mali, and he had asked me to come to join the UN again in Mali to build the radio station to accompany that peace process that was being leveraged through the Algerian Accords, the Algiers Accords. And so I did. And that was a whole different type of adventure, and also a very unique one. But with many of the basic concepts that I've shared already, so I'm not going to repeat everything, but, I went there with my little baby who was 9 months old at the time, and decided to move to Bamako. And I arrived in Bamako just as Ebola hit. And so that was a very, hitting the ground running. The radio station, of course, did not exist at all. So this was really coming in to build this. But in the meantime, I did very quickly end up mounting and working with, of course, many others in building a campaign on Ebola awareness, and working with the specific Ebola mission that had been deployed to try to keep it under control in the region. So that gave us a very interesting start of life in Mali. And Mali was a place that was ridden by conflict, but not only conflict, internal conflict, but because of the specific positioning of Mali in the Sahel, there was also a lot of jihadist movements that were taking place at the time, and jihadist recruitments, and many different terrorist cells and groups that were trying to be attached, smaller cells that were trying to attach themselves to the bigger cells of Daesh, and of other bigger terrorist groups. And so it's a situation where peacekeeping had to also reinvent itself. Peacekeeping is about working within post-conflict situations, whereas here there was clearly, first of all, still the conflict brewing, and also a multidimensional situation that came on top of it, which really was complex, and is still very complicated for the UN to handle, because there are a lot of attacks against the UN troops. I don't think there was a day that went by that I wasn't, standing in front of a casket that was coming back from one area or another, of peacekeepers who had been ambushed, or community members, or so it was a very complicated situation. The necessity to create a radio station in a country where there was already many radio stations was a challenge in and of itself, where, again, like the story I tell you about Haiti, there was a lot of negotiations to actually get this radio station agreed upon, by the UN as well as by the government. I had to do, and confront myself with a lot of lobbies who did not want this radio station to get on air because they knew that it would be listened to. And I built this radio station differently than others, where I really, through a lot of analysis that I did with my colleagues, I realized the importance that it was to ensure that there were spaces dedicated to the different languages and different cultures on the same airwaves, and that it wasn't just going to be another radio broadcasting in Bambara, which is the national language, and in French to the communities, but it was going to be a reverse kind of communities broadcasting into the capital to be able to share what their particular concerns were as the peace process was being negotiated. And music, yes, just to tell you that story, because I'm not going to go on and on and on about these radios, but music was the way that we decided to actually implement the credibility of the radio station, this particular station. And it was to go to the different communities across Mali, look at the amazing richness of the Sahel region and the different instruments and the different voices, and writing a song. And when I arrived, to build this, it was just myself and the technical director who started creating the concept of what this radio station was, and we would sit there with a piece of paper and just draw it up and draw up through a lot of analysis that we've done, of course, with local communities, what were the necessities and the programs and the importance of culture and music as a way to create peace building. And we were able to connect different musicians across the country. We wrote this song, we wrote the words actually together of reuniting the country, and then brought all musicians to come together and write a different version of their song. So with the different rhythms and their different music. So each community had a specific version of the same song with the same words, but in their languages. And then through a very crafty production agency in Bamako, we were able to bring all of these voices together and the different melodies into one, which became the international version of this song, which became the song of the radio, right? The launch, the theme of Mikado FM. And at the same time, we were playing both the local versions, so the unique versions of the different languages and cultures, and at the same time, the international one, which brought all of them together in one unison. And this, when we were setting up the satellites, we were playing local music and local languages across the airwaves, and people, for the first time, realized that they were hearing their own music in their own language on a national airwave, and that hadn't happened. And that started the beginning of what was going to be this very powerful peace-building radio station. So culture and art are very much part of what we're talking about when we talk about dialogue and peace building. A lot of things happened through the building of this radio station, including lobbying to create spaces and protected spaces for women to have an opportunity to weigh in politically into the peace agreements, women who didn't have the opportunity or were not authorized normally to speak on issues that were linked to politics. So there were a lot of lessons learned, of course, through that as well.
That's so beautiful. Using art and music to unite not just different voices, but different cultures and different languages is really, really brilliant. So when did you end up leaving Mali, and how did you end up with IFAD?
So I ended up leaving Mali I set up the radio station and left a bit sooner than I thought I was going to leave. Again, at the time, there were a lot of tensions, and I lived through the Radisson attack, which was in Bamako, and I was with my son, who was very young. So I ended up getting a job. So I left in 2016, and was named by the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time to lead the UN Information Center for Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. And the reason was, and this links back to the story I told you earlier, the experience that I had specifically working on, in that particular context, on the FARC, or with the FARC rather, and that in the Amazon, and the experience that I was bringing into the table, also having met and kept touch with the president of Ecuador at the time, Rafael Correa. So I was politically pretty well keyed into the area, and I assumed that that's why I got the position, and ended up moving to Bogota with my son to accompany the peace building, or the peace accords that were still in construct in Cuba, with the negotiations happening in Cuba. So I arrived at a quite an early stage. The UN Information Center is very different, right? It's a very different ambition, I guess, than just, or not just, but than coming into a peacekeeping operation to build a radio. But really, it's the same kind of concept, which is, I was the UN Information Center, and as a director, I was the spokesperson, or the voice from the UNHQ and for the Secretary General for that region. And it was extremely important to build the different spaces, to get people to ensure that people understood what the process was involved, where the process was at in terms of this process of negotiation with the FARC, which was extremely difficult and extremely complicated. At the same time, there was an ambition to start moving the 2030 agenda. There are many other things that came into play here, because the idea of these UN information centers is to share the common decisions of the Security Council in New York and to bring those into the different communities and landscape, and get populations engaged in moving these, engaged in these decisions, and make them their own. And never have I come in, or have I worked in contexts where you come in with solutions. That's not the point. It's sharing the information to get people, governments, institutions, civil society, the youth, the women involved in the different constructs. So the SDGs and working on the 2030 agenda was very much at the heart of my work in the area, at the same time as accompanying that process, and at the same time as a very severe crisis ensued in Venezuela, which led to very strong migratory and refugee movement. So there was a lot of work involved on all of these fronts. I worked on a campaign specifically on the environment, and creating the link between the necessity to address climate change, which was becoming more and more of a concern, climate change to conflict, to the different solutions, engaging the private sector. Again, there's just so much to talk about, but it was also a very different type of experience, and very, very much, it was a wonderful experience in how the youth really got involved in becoming the actors of change, and the networks of youth that we created in these different countries.
How did you create these networks of youth?
Oh, well, we worked in different areas through the academic circles and the schools, of course, doing a lot of advocacy on climate and on climate change, getting them involved in the different campaigns on Save Our Oceans, but getting them to also think about the 2030 agenda and how they would build their communities forward. One of the unique, I can give you a very unique example, was when I was, I was traveling in the area regularly. When I arrived in Quito, which is the capital of Ecuador, for a particular conference, which is Habitat 3, which happens every 3 years, which is a conference to think about the future of our cities. The thematic was the future of smart cities, or how smart cities were going to integrate into Latin America, and creating that construct between imagining cities and the link to rural communities in the Andean region. And I was quite astounded to find that the youth were not involved, that this was about international, mayors and presidents from around the world coming to think about this in Quito. So Quito just happened to be the hub, but they didn't engage local populations. And I said, and I thought it was a missed opportunity to not get youth engagement into thinking about these topics and linking it to the Sustainable Development Goals. And one night I decided to write to Lego, out of all people, in Denmark. The CEO, I found him on LinkedIn. I had no contact with them. And I wrote to LinkedIn, to Lego rather, and I asked them, could we build specific Lego sets so that kids could start building? We could train them to understand the Sustainable Development Goals, and they could build their own platforms and their own constructs of how they saw their community shaping up to becoming closer to these SDGs. And they actually responded, and we actually went into production on this. And again, a very long story, but we did end up getting these kids to train children, and during the initial launch of this, trained thousands of kids who were coming in by buses around the conference to start thinking about the SDGs. And Ecuador had just been shaken by a very powerful earthquake, so there was a lot of rebuilding to do, and they started actually building. It was amazing to see how quickly little kids understood the SDGs, quicker than the older ones, quicker than the adults, and started building their platforms. And from that, I evolved the concept into, then we launched this in Colombia, and in the most vulnerable areas, in game libraries, in the most vulnerable communities, where kids were actually building the future that they wanted, and bringing in, and then I linked in the private sector to actually see whether they could construct in real what these children were constructing through these Lego platforms, and it happened. And that created a whole network of youth engagement, and the resilience and the brilliance that these kids had to, even if with very little internet connection, to be able to start creating blogs and photos of their projects and their world. And it really had a domino effect. And I really do think that the importance of this ripple effect, that when you work with local ideas and communities, that you don't imagine the impact and the ripple effect that it can have across a community, across a region, across a nation, across the world. And I think that that's the beauty of what I learned through all of the stories that I've told, is the importance of going back to the people behind, behind our humanity. Every child, every community has an amazing capacity to think about its future and about the solutions. And solutions cannot just be given. They need to engage the people themselves, so that they are then building their own sustainability.
Absolutely, and I love hearing. I'm glad everyone got to hear that story of your gumption and creativity in reaching out to Lego to bring in the resources, but also then using that to engage kids and connecting with the game libraries to bring the solutions, not the solutions, rather, bring the tools for them to create their own solutions to the spaces that they were already occupying. Thought all of that was extraordinarily creative and wonderful to hear. I'd love to move on to IFAD, where you're currently at, and hear a bit of how you ended up coming to work at IFAD, and tell us a bit about what you're doing right now in your role as a director there.
Yeah, so I'm directing the global communications and advocacy for the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which is based in Rome, and which kind of seemed like the next natural step, in that its core mandate is really to address how to leave no one behind, the last mile of reaching the most rural and remote communities across the world, and engaging them in solutions to strengthen their capacity to contribute to rural economies, therefore circular economies. If the world has really worked and tried to come together on addressing global challenges, it may not have worked as well as or as fast as we had hoped. And that's because it's an experience of winning and losing. It's an experience of life every day, of realizing which ways you're going that are correct or not correct. And if today, despite all of the efforts that are being done, we still have more conflicts, we still have, tremendous issues that we have to deal with, such as feeding the world, such as making sure that people have access to basic necessities. The realization, I think, through these 76 years of diplomacy since the UN was born, right after the World War II, I think has been realizing that if we don't put people into the solutions, like I just said, we're not going to move forward. So it's wonderful to have member states engaged in looking for solutions together, and government and high-level government discussions and so on and so forth. But why did the high-level governments come to this decision of the 2030 agenda and of these 16 sustainable development goals? It is because there was a core realization that if we don't go back to address the basic necessities of humanity, we won't move forward. And the basic necessities of all of us, just regardless of where we come from, is that it's getting out of poverty, it's accessing water, accessing food, accessing shelter, accessing education and health, innovation to be able to move forward, technology to be able to support us in our ideas and ambitions of growth. It's alliances to be able to work. Nobody can work alone. Alliances are key to be able to move anything forward. Addressing the climate challenges, which are extremely important, saving our oceans. That's what the Sustainable Development Goals are all about. And there's this realization, and again, the fact that this has been voted on by the 193 member states is a big deal, because getting countries from all these different types of social economic constructs and different realities to decide on something common is very complex. And so that's, that the fact that the world has become united to work on this is important. And out of that really came I think is now much higher on global agendas than ever before, is starting to focus on going back to the roots of our systems, and that is the rural communities. The rural communities are responsible for feeding us, for feeding the world, and yet they themselves often don't feed themselves. So they may feed us, but they often don't feed themselves. The women who are actually working the land in a lot of remote communities around the world don't have land rights. There are a lot of unknown stories from rural communities who are supporting us in our day-to-day humanity that are not being told. And it is time to go and look at a lot more and fund a lot more and be a lot more innovative in terms of how do we bring rural communities into our daily realities. It's not because we're talking about farming and that we're sitting in a city that it doesn't touch us. Actually, it does. You eat every day. Therefore, think about those who are growing that food. And so that's where the narrative is extremely important, because the only way we're going to create mass engagement and interest in this is to be able to go back to, what does this matter to me or to you or to, Daniel, who's listening to this, or to Pat or to Bright or to Kate, why does this matter to us? And it matters because it's part of our daily life, whether we realize it or not. And so it's extremely important. This is where, again, I go back to the importance of information and communication, is that we use it for a purpose, that we use it to really create those constructs, and really share this importance of the domino effect. IFAD has a particular advantage today, is that it's a very hybrid agency. It's a hybrid agency that has a niche expertise, and hybrid meaning that it's both a UN development agency and at the same time it's an international financial institution, similar to the World Bank, similar to the African Development Bank, and so on. And the fact that it wears both hats means that it has the capacity through its local partners to actually fund long-term projects, long-term rural development. And if we don't start shifting the paradigm to long-term, we're constantly going to be in a circle of aid. So you're funding short-term projects to address a very specific problem, and then that ends, and then you go back to actually still needing to mend that need or that gap, and so you're going into a cycle of aid, need. And I think that the only way to move forward from that is to start looking long-term, because if you don't create long-term funding to be able to then include in that training, education, and self-sustainability, then how do you support people into actually mending those needs or mending those gaps that will enable them to then move forward without having a necessity for that aid? And so today we're seeing a paradigm shift. And I hope that that will come out at the end of this year when we are all, discussing food systems, as the world is now engaged on thinking about how do we strengthen our food systems. And there's this huge UN summit in September. But a summit is just a summit. Not to say that it's not good, but it's all of the work that is being done around it, and the narrative and the awareness that needs to be that we need to create alliances to address this in a much more sustainable way. I think that's what's important. So that's why I ended up with IFAD, is to be able to make sure that narrative really crosses borders.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example of the kinds of long-term investments or investments in long-term development projects that IFAD makes?
Oh, well, there's so many that it's they're in different countries. You work with, obviously, rural communities and farmers and smallholder agricultures, as well as looking at what that means to be able to take smallholder farmers into a more viable type of pathway. So working with them on the particular agricultural methods, addressing climate change and the impact that it has, bringing in technical expertise to see how they can become more sustainable, but also enter the market and economic markets to be able to leverage what they're growing, looking at also the way that they're growing and the environmental concerns regarding that as well, looking at biodiversity. There's a lot of thinking that goes into this. Right now, the world is usually concentrated on 4 crops, or has been concentrated on 4 crops, and that is not diverse enough to address some of the issues that we're dealing with when we talk about healthy environment and healthy nutrition and addressing climate change. And so we need to diversify our crops. So there's a lot of projects that are being developed in terms of crop diversification, but also, some of the particular expertise is how do you use modern technology today, information technology, such as the phones that we have in our hands right now, to be able to support farmers as they move forward, and using, creating those links between the specific farmers and the specific technology that is going to help them be more sustainable and more resilient, creating networks of rural communities to support each other as well. So there are many different examples. There's a beautiful example of a work project that was done in Tunisia with women who had, and this was a very interesting social story as well, divorced women who had not been very well accepted because of their status in Tunisia, and who had decided to go off in the remote fields of Tunisia and start planting tomatoes because it was a very fertile area for tomatoes, to try to sustain themselves and create a new type of community where they helped each other with their children, and helped each other deal with their particular situation of being divorcees in a country that didn't accept it. And a project was funded to support them in creating a link between their tomato growing and the production chain. And their tomatoes are now being used for Heinz ketchup. They're being used for Buitoni, pasta sauce, and they've become very successful, and therefore their success has also helped strengthen their community and their region and their country. That's just one very small example of a story that I found impactful. But there's a lot of work that goes into working in the most remote areas. Right now, we are starting to explore with IFAD projects in South Sudan, which had been put on hold because of the security situations, and yet IFAD is present even in the most difficult areas, and even in the conflict zones. It's probably because it works through local partners, it's probably one of the agencies that doesn't have to leave in very high conflict zones. But in South Sudan, there's a lot to be done with aquaculture and fisheries, and supporting them in developing that industry, as many others. If we help, Africa is extremely rich and extremely fertile. For instance, if we're looking at the African continent, and we work across the world, right? Latin America and Asia and the Middle East. So But just going back to Africa is so rich, and there is so many possibilities, and our rural populations are extremely resilient. They have the capacity to feed the world. It is not normal today that people still go hungry, don't have access to food. The world, and we all have a responsibility in terms of in our different areas and different contexts to address this issue in one way or another.
Absolutely. So, in your role as director of communications and advocacy, what do you end up spending most of your time focused on?
Well, I manage a large division, or I direct a large division. So I'm working on managing teams to make sure that those stories are well told, that we work a lot on advocacy, but we also work, of course, at my level, also on the political advocacy, which is making sure that these stories and these projects and the relevance and our true capacity to deliver is well communicated to the member states, so that we have the engagement of the member states and our donors and our stakeholders to move forward. The clear ambition of IFAD today is to double its impact by 2030, so that we can address many of the areas that are not being currently supported. And for that, of course, you need funding, and for that, you need support. And so that's a lot of the work, of course, that's being done from a capital point of view, or from a headquarters point of view, versus when you're working on the field, which is it's a very different reality. And I'm looking at new and innovative platforms where we can spread these kind of stories, give a voice to the most remote rural populations. We're going to be launching soon a campaign on rural voices with a specific hashtag for that, to make sure that they are engaged in solutions and can also talk about their own realities and their stories. We published a book earlier this year called "The People Behind Your Plate," which is basically about that. It's very graphic. It's photography to get you engaged into their realities. It's their story, and seeing how it connects to everybody around the world, I think, is extremely important.
Absolutely. I want to be conscious of your time, but before we move on, I'd love to hear, what would a blue sky, if things go perfectly from IFAD's work over the next 5 to 10 years, what would you see happening in the world? How would that translate?
Well, I think it's beyond IFAD's work. I think it's bringing the different constructs together, making sure that communities, that as we move forward, we have a much more solid people-based engagement process, that we use these modern technologies to actually leverage solutions from the ground up. That yes, it's extremely important to continue also with advocating and getting governments to put these, the SDGs on the top of their agendas, and looking at ways to address, human rights, to address climate change, to address gender-based violence as one of the, the SDG 5 is gender, to move the world towards a more equitable society, economically, socially, and so on. But I think that the way to really, truly move the needle on this is also by creating much stronger basis of population engagements, and going back to the micro-local. People in their communities have the capacity to move things, and it matters. A lot of people say, well, it doesn't matter. But, my action isn't going to create it's not going to change the world. But actually think of my action plus my action plus my action, multiply it by everybody in the world, and it does actually make a difference. And I always use, COVID as the example of the lockdown. When almost the entire world went into lockdown, the earth around us changed. The world, the earth and the environment, the skies went blue, talking about blue skies. Fish came back into areas that we hadn't seen in long times, right? In Paris, in the River Seine, in Venice, and around the world, everybody saw the earth change and rebirth. And so, yes, of course, common action does matter because it compounds one to the other to the other. What I'd like to see is that conscious collectiveness and a renewed belief in our own possibilities in making a change and making a difference. And I know sometimes that sounds, idealistic, but idealism is necessary. But it is actually backed by real data that showcases that yes, it does make a difference, and that we are responsible for shaping our communities, for relooking at moving our educational constructs, starting to use new platforms to address some of the fundamental changes that need to happen in education processes so that the youth actually, for them, it becomes natural to make the right choices or to make healthier choices for their lives, but also for the lives of their communities and their future within the necessities of addressing climate change, of addressing, the wonderful, but also the dangerous of technology, and so on and so forth. So that's really, the importance of communication and information, caring about that, funding it a lot more than it is today, because that is what leads and shapes the minds and hearts of the future, I think is something that I'd like to see happen. And one topic we didn't really touch upon, and I think that'll be for a different time, but as we've been through as I've lived through all of these different experiences in different countries, and as we've just gone through COVID, one of the issues that really we do need to fundamentally address is gender-based violence. The silent pandemic, the UN called it. The silent pandemic, because it was happening at the same time as COVID was happening. And it became much more of a public narrative, not common, but a public narrative that, gender-based violence affects 1 in 3 women around the world, everywhere. Whether you come, regardless of what community or what level you come from, or the, it affects everybody. And I think that is something that also needs to fundamentally be addressed, because this equity, this world can only be shaped if we all have a chance, and that includes men and women. It includes boys and girls, and we do again have the capacity to move the needle forward on that. And it starts with education. It starts with rethinking how we educate our children moving forward on this, and then also make sure that these stories don't stay silent, because we need to rethink our constructs when it comes to the legal mechanisms in place, the protective mechanisms in place for victims of violence. And I'm not going to say just women, because it's not just women, victims of violence, to efficiently put an end to violence, to be able to actually say no and move from advocacy to solutions. And this impacts what we were talking about, rural communities. It is at the roots of conflicts and war. It is at the roots of hunger and famine. It is the roots of our society, and it does also need to be addressed fundamentally.
Absolutely. I think, as you said, we could have a kind of extensive discussion just on this. Before, I do want to be mindful of your time, but can you tell us a bit about how you saw gender-based violence playing out in some of these rural communities, where, I mean, we know it's everywhere, but how did it play out in some of your kind of peacekeeping experiences? And then what do you think the quickest, not that it's a quick fix, but what are some of the dynamics rather that contribute to it, whether it be specific to a geography or across the world?
Well, I saw it play out in very different areas in different ways. Going back to the peacekeeping and to the experiences I had in these different countries across Africa, notably, but also in different areas. But in these countries where I worked, because I'm not going to speak for all, the necessity to create safe spaces for women to actually have a political voice and to be able to participate in that and be able to actually enter the job market, actually have access and for their families or for their partners or for their husbands to understand the fact that they did want to work, that they wanted to become journalists, that they wanted to be able to speak, that they could actually also lead programs on politics and have an important impact in those narratives. That was extremely challenging. And women, I had staff who were beaten, killed, jailed, for wanting to have that space. And a lot of it has to do again with education. I was out on in Juba at one point around the electoral process with my teams, a group of women actually who were journalists and who had braved all of these challenges to become journalists at Radio Mariah. And the security saw us arriving. The security in the city saw us arriving, and they did not like to see women with microphones. Not first of all, they had an issue with information, and it was out of these war contexts and conflictual contexts. Information is often feared. That's a whole other issue that we didn't that we can talk about one day. But the fact of being women, they beat us up, they kicked us to the ground. It was, you women, you should not be here. And that violence is pervasive in wanting to create those spaces. So, and this happened in many different contexts. Myself as a woman, having been when I go back to those many years ago of being a war correspondent, and in certain areas where people were not used to seeing a woman doing this kind of job, and wondering what I was doing, why was I not home taking care of children, was I married, was I not, and how, what was I doing? It's challenging because we're facing cultural differences, cultural barriers. And again, I don't ever want to judge. I just think that we need to move forward and have constructive dialogues and discussions to address this. Violence in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Latin America, and especially, everywhere. I'm not going to say especially, but in the different communities where I started speaking a lot in international forums on gender-based violence, and women who were trying to address this and figure out how to move out of violence, but not have the constructs to deal with it, the legal constructs, the proper constructs. We have international frameworks that have advanced tremendously to address these issues. And we have, even at a constitutional level laws that speak to this. But then when it comes to the practice, that's a whole different reality. It's, situations drag on and on and on. And I haven't spoken to any woman who has had to denounce violence and who hasn't said they regret having denounced it through the official, channels, the authoritative channels, the police, the lawyers, the judicial processes, because it's been such a harrowing experience, because it's so long, because it drags on, because they do find themselves in very, very delicate situations. A lot of women who unfortunately are killed after denouncing violence. Usually they're killed after they've denounced. Statistically speaking, feminicides have gone up across the world in tremendous rates, especially during this COVID lockdown. There's something that needs to be addressed in terms of what are the mechanisms to support a shift, while we also address root causes, which is education. And again, this is not a conversation that should create a divide of women against men or men against women. That's not what the issue is here. We need to rethink about the constructs of our society that leads this type of violence to happen. And that really is about reshaping the narratives, and valuing each and every one of us as we move forward and grow into these countries and societies.
Beautifully said. Just want to get a few final questions in before, if you have time, we open it up to some of the folks here for a few short ones.
Yeah, sure.
As those of us who've been here for some time have gotten here, you've got an incredible wealth of experience in so many different situations and environments. What are some principles of conflict resolution, if you could sum them up, that you would share for us all to take away?
I think it's listening, listening and creating spaces for dialogue and breaking down the misconceptions and understanding the unconscious biases. We talk about this, and I think sometimes people roll their eyes because it just kind of feels like a throwaway type of word, but we all have unconscious biases. We all go back to our comfort zones when we feel fear, when we feel angst, when we are concerned about our survival tomorrow, whatever that means. It can be within an organization where you don't get along with somebody, and therefore it actually hits on that fiber of the fear of your tomorrow, that survival instincts of fighting for your own space, or for your truth. When we realize, and we all do it, I'm talking about it, but I'm the first one that falls into this. It's human nature, right, to go back to what is most familiar, and then to address what is not, what you don't understand, or anger, or that is thrown at you through fear, and then that leads to conflict. So these are human lessons, I think, that are important, and I think that's the fundamental, is that as we move forward, this fundamental recognition of the need for our own acknowledgement is important to address any types of solutions that we're going to move the world forward on. The importance of going back to people and the engagement of people as at the root of processes. Yes, processes are extremely important, but we have to go back to the people and to people-based engagement, and the belief of these networks that are being created to be able to push for a better tomorrow, and a stronger tomorrow, and address the root causes of conflict, of climate change, and so on.
Right on. Listening and empathy and seeing other people as human, and understanding them and yourself seem fundamental. If you could share quickly, how do you feel you've spoken to education, you've spoken to communication versus information. Is there anything else you'd say on how we change cultures?
We change cultures by getting to know each other, by being aware of each other. We change cultures by examining ourselves. We change cultures in that way. I think in going back to what matters to each and every one of us, and how actually really realizing that what matters across and very far from me, actually the domino effect that it has, that will affect me. Going back to that, the reason that we are actually coming together through these different platforms, through a lot of new constructs that have taken place in terms of creating these dialogues and people-based engagement, is because there is a necessity for us to exchange ideas as well as solutions moving forward, and to believe in that as a true fundamental of the, and again, I don't want to sound cliche, but of the yes, we can. And I think that why did that resonate so much in politics at one point, is because it goes back to that core fiber of people's wanting to believe that yes, they can, yes, they matter. And I think that's extremely important.
Right on. And finally, and maybe we'll just take one or two questions for, if that's okay, for those who would like. So feel free to put your hand up. But While folks are doing so, what are the biggest challenges or areas of concern for you, and what are the areas that give you the most inspiration and hope?
I think that what gives me, I think that a lot of the challenges are addressing some of the misinformation, the misconstruction that leads to tensions. I think it's very challenging. We can talk about the importance of it. We can talk about what we need to do to address it, but actually shifting that global narrative, addressing tensions and conflicts, addressing disinformation that fuels conflicts, going to the root causes, because of healing is difficult when you've been offended. And I'm talking about either whether it's a personal offense or whether in the context of conflict or country-based conflict or racism or hate speech or extreme, to be able to take the steps forward from that. And it doesn't mean forgetting. Reconciliation with the other doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean erasing what has been done in the past. And I think that's really important to understand. It doesn't mean erasing the wrongs that have been done, but it also means believing that if you don't take those steps forward in wanting to weave and to create a new unity, a new future with the other that may have done you harm, then it will be very difficult for societies to move forward at any level. And I think that that's something that we need to engage on and to believe in and to move on as ourselves as people, and then create this in terms of communities and societies. And that also needs to be taught in schools. And I think that we really also need to reshape our educations, the methodologies that are used to educate, to be able to take in these real constructs that are needed for the future. It's not just about learning math and science and reading and writing and grammar and all these wonderful things. It's also about how do we live more constructively in societies. And I don't think that that's something that's necessarily sufficiently addressed within traditional educational constructs. And in terms of the future and the hope, there's a lot of hope that I have because I see how much people are engaged. I think there is a belief and a much stronger recognition that we do need to unite to address these challenges that are facing it, and that the technology that, as I've pointed out, is risky, is also allowing us to actually connect with each other. I'm sitting here in Rome, you're sitting in Toronto, people listening maybe sitting in other parts of the world. We have this capacity to connect now beyond borders to actually move these ideas forward.
Beautiful. Thank you. Had a few folks who wanted to come up and share. Charles, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Elliot. And Helen, always, and this time particularly, that Elliot has asked some great questions and given you the opportunity to share. But I had a specific question about radio. As you know, Suki 222 is trying to help and get the word out. What would it cost, or does it cost, the nonprofit to broadcast, and how many people are available to reach through that network?
That's a bit of a wide question because radio has evolved a lot. So I'm giving you specific examples of these peacekeeping radios that were built through satellite technology. It is very expensive to be able to broadcast on FM waves and to be able to have all of the constructs that are involved. It's not that expensive, but it's expensive. But technology has moved so far ahead now that what we're doing right now is almost like radio broadcasting, right? So creating networks of communication are a lot simpler in that way than they used to be.
Right, but yes, no question. And Clubhouse is only going to take more of that share very shortly. But is the UN stations that are set up and operating today, can nonprofits go on and say, hey, here's something that's good for your community? Is there a network to be heard for nonprofits operating in the areas that are?
Yeah, of course. I mean, these radio stations are like news and information public radio stations. So we know that there's a lot of programs that are being done on innovation, on solutions, on bringing the voice to other organizations and other even people-based engagements that are being leveraged in these particular areas. So of course there's space for it. Like it's a media type of construct. So it's bringing the awareness and then making sure that they cover it.
Awesome. We'll try to make it interesting. Thank you so much, Helen.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we have Vincent's friend, Eric. Eric, welcome to Clubhouse.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'm completely new. First talk. But what I'm really curious about, since you're, the kind of places you've worked in, I look at social change methodologies, and some of them are like facilitation methods like nonviolent communication, process work, deep democracy, restorative circles. There's all these methodologies that they intend to create systemic change as well, and certainly also in conflict. Is there, for instance, within the UN and these bigger organizations, is there a lot of awareness around it enough? And do these methods work? Could they work? Could they work better? I don't know if that's a clear enough question.
You're asking whether there is enough awareness of all of these different programs, you mean?
Yeah, there are facilitation methods that there are thousands of trainers doing these kind of methods all over the world, and they're all kind of communication, group dynamic methods. And I wonder if there's an awareness within the UN about them, and if they work or not, if it's something that's been evolved or not.
Yeah, I think that, I understand that really awareness of the fact that they work. These peacekeeping radios have evolved over the years. They're not just in the countries that I've spoken about. There's a very, very famous radio. That was kind of the launch of this particular model, Radio Gapi in Congo, and so on. But I think that there needs to be a lot more awareness on the outside of these lessons that we've learned. I think through peace building, through peacekeeping, through these different kind of community engagement methods that we apply. It's not just through radio, but a lot of community engagement that is being done across the world that I think would merit being shared a lot more. And that's kind of why I'm doing this, is to be able to share those experiences, because those experiences match a lot of the things that can be done anywhere we are in the world at a community level. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, kind of. Part of it, I am really wondering what needs to exist. I fully see the value of a radio station. I also heard John Marks, I guess is his name. He created a football it's a show, a TV show on football, and it passes through different countries, and it's also about conflict. So they deal with issues like diversity and stuff like that, and it really works. It reaches a big audience, so it helps spread the word better. And I guess on these methodologies, I guess also there needs to be collected clarity on what it is, because one method doesn't know about the other method, and I guess you know a lot of methods I never heard of, and I might know a lot of methods you never heard of. And I wonder how to better share this and how to better create a world where people know about these methods.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that there are inclusion programs through sports and through programs that can create that extremely strong impact. I think you've touched upon something very important, which I didn't have time to get to, but it's the importance of using global and mass media to be able to share these experiences, and to create networks of change through that. Right now we're looking at developing a program of actors of change for the SDGs with some major networks, looking at the idea of creating, designing new types of sitcoms, I think, through fiction, and through Netflix, and getting gamification that I think really needs to be used to be able to leverage these kinds of changes in social constructions that we're talking about. Gaming is extremely powerful amongst the youth. So how do we get those involved in creating games that are actually for the social good, and creating games around the Sustainable Development Goals? And there's a lot of, I think, untapped opportunities to be able to showcase this at a much broader level that I think we need to push on. Obviously, the mass media, films, Hollywood, and so on are ways to create major changes within societies, and they have a tremendous impact. So I think that is a way that needs to be something that needs to be explored a lot more. There are groups and production companies that are starting to be interested in telling those stories and sharing that a lot further than it is being shared today, to break away and to break down those silos. And I think that's extremely necessary. And you're right, I don't think that it's there enough.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, enough for now since the time is passing. Thank you for your answer.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
So we are almost an hour over what we had expected. So I brought Kate up because she has some quite relevant experience. Are you okay with one more question before we wrap?
Yeah. I mean, if there are other who waited extremely patiently while we were having this very long conversation, so I would invite other people also if they have comments or questions. I think that's what's interesting as well.
Okay, just want to.
Fundamental.
I know it's getting late there, so I just want to be conscious of that. But Kate, welcome.
Thank you very much, Elia and Helene. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and insight. I could listen to you all day. I did have two questions. One was actually just coming off of what Eric had mentioned, and that was, so the first question is, why has there been a delay in media, specifically in TV and streaming services, and getting these narratives to a broader audience? What's been the holdup as you see it?
I think maybe it's a lack of basic awareness. Also, a lack of things get enough engagement, get enough audiences. The media world has shifted a lot in terms of making money, as you know, especially in first world contexts and constructs, and what gets them ratings. So I think the concern for ratings and the concern for immediacy and has kind of put a stop to the more in-depth type of narratives and the stronger stories that need to be shared and told. So I think that's why there's a lot of independent networks that are starting to come up to actually give a space to this. The world of news and information and media has changed a lot. It's gotten a lot more. People don't have necessarily the patience as you have, here today to listen to stories or time. It's not even just a question of patience, but it's also a question of time. And as you see, people navigate very, very quickly now, right? They go from 100-character tweets to a small snippet on through Instagram. The consumption of news and information has changed. So how do we get these kinds of lessons learned and sharing of stories through that? I think that's something that's still very difficult to bring an answer to, because it needs time to talk. We need time to have these kinds of conversations and to share. But if people want everything to be in tidbits of information that are 30 seconds, 50 seconds, it's difficult. I was talking to I'm doing right now a series of bilateral discussions on what communications needs to address to move the needle on the SDGs, for instance. And one particular member state I was having a conversation with was saying that they had talked to their child, who, this woman ambassador had talked to her child about IFAD. And of course, they didn't know what IFAD was because we are a very specialized agency. But she said, they address climate change. And he said, oh, I'm really interested in that. And she said, well, how would you want to get more information from what they do on climate change? And he said, well, if I could watch a really short YouTube video or some type of meme on Instagram or something like that. But, the way that we consume information has changed. So how do we create that middle ground, or how do we bring the two realities together to be able to address this and share these ideas and concepts? I think it's something that is still being defined right now.
Thank you. And that partially answered my second question, which was, how have you seen, in your experience, how have you seen communication in journalism, specifically war correspondence? How have you seen that information and that narrative change over the years in terms of the coverage? Is there anything missing and that you'd like to see overcome or corrected, either in the methodology or the content?
Yeah, I would like to be able to go back to a time where, journalists have the time to actually get to know the stories and the context. They have the time to go and develop and understand what they're talking about and what they're reporting on. There's less and less of that, unfortunately. A lot of it is now going through a few wires, the APs and the AFPs and the Reuters and so on, which are very important. But, then the coverage goes through those few lines, those few people that are on the field reporting back through these wires that journalists are using to tell these stories. But that's not real, that's not lived journalism, right? And so therefore it loses a lot of the stories that it could tell. It loses the space to be able to actually spend time to know about the communities you're reporting on. In South Sudan, when we were there for the referendum for independence, for instance, journalists from around the world flooded in just for the referendum process. Did they really know about South Sudan or the South Sudanese? No. Did they really understand what had led to this decision for independence, who these people were? It's, too easy to just fly in and turn on the camera and just say, I'm live here, from South Sudan, as it is, the newest country is about to declare itself, and so on and so forth. It's easy to create that narrative, but what's behind it? Because the stories behind it is what really will shape the world going forward. And if we don't tell the stories, and again, if we don't take the time to do that, we won't be addressing the real issues that'll help us move forward. So we need to go back to that. And we need to, I think, retrain the consumption of news and information. And again, and I said this earlier, we also really need to address the difference between communication and information and go back to the roots of information. The roots of information being the fact that information needs to support people into understanding the world they live in, making better choices, having access to education that will enable them to live better or to live stronger, which is very different than communicating between each other and sharing thoughts and opinions, which is also equally important. But, I think that information needs to be salvaged, and it's at the ethical spaces, and the importance that it has in constructing societies is losing itself. And I think that is going to be a very strong challenge as we move forward.
Thank you very much, Helene.
You're welcome.
Steve, welcome.
Hi, Elliot. Hi, Helene, everybody. So I heard, I didn't hear the beginning of this, but what I heard was amazing. But I just want to ask, Helene, have you come across someone called Firdaus Karas of something called Chalk Moose Media? Just a bit of background. He's a creator of animated video shorts that have been seen over 1 billion times. something like 400 languages, close to 200 countries, and about over 400 separate animations, all to do with everything from Zika virus, Ebola. Many years ago, he created a series of short videos to do with, I think they were called Buzz and Bite, to do with malaria, and I think it was the Three Amigos to do with HIV. And these are all focused on behavior change in the language, culturally acceptable, and just really amazing. And his model is he's created this content funded sometimes through agencies, sometimes through donors or sponsors, and given it out to the NGOs who have got it out to the people who needed to see them. And he's been recognized for, I think, preventing over 1 million deaths around HIV many, many years ago, and has really been a big part in changing behavior. So I just wonder what you think of this methodology and if you come across it.
No, I'm not aware of that particular methodology. I have been aware of other types of similar type of media expressions, but not this one. Yeah, I'd be really interested in knowing more about it.
Yeah, I mean, he's remarkable. It's Chocolate Moose Media, but the website I think is chockmoose.com or something. But very happy to introduce you. But you know, I would echo what you're saying before. We need to explore all medias and especially gamification to help people, you know, understand what they got to do and you know, collaborate in their futures. It's really, really important. So thanks for this, Elliot, and Helene. Thanks for setting it up. It's been amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Absolutely. Using media, using film, as Helen spoke to, and even gamification, it makes it accessible to the average person. I think, as you've spoken to, Helen, we need things that we need to be able to reach quite broadly, and as you pointed out, folks often just don't have the time to listen, let alone the patience. And so finding ways to communicate these ideas and share these stories in forms that are digestible or appropriate for where they're at become the new listening to the local voice, so to speak. But wanted to give folks in the audience one last chance to come on up if there's anyone who did want to share. But maybe final question is, again, you've got such, and we really appreciate you being here and taking all this time and sharing the real, like, incredible wealth of experience you've had. Is there something you could sum up?
That's a big question, Elliot. You know, I think I'm just, you know, I'm one person who can't, you know, I'm the last person to have, you know, these big thoughts of wisdom, because I think we all have a unique approach and understanding of what moves the world forward. But I think from my personal experience, the core fundamental, and I think I said that earlier, but the core fundamental that we need to address as societies is the importance of leaving no one behind, and ensuring that there is respect and dignity, and that people are acknowledged and recognized anywhere around the world, because the fundamental necessity to be heard and to be recognized is the first step to then recognizing the other. If you don't feel recognized, if you don't feel that you matter to the world that you live in and that you're born into, then how can anyone expect you to listen to the others who are telling you, you know, perhaps what is the direction to take or solutions that are available? So I think that that's extremely important. I always go back to something very fundamental, is that when a child is born, you know, she comes into the world crying, and that the first necessity, crying, yes, because it's, you know, painful to take that first breath, but it's also the fact of shouting out your existence. You've come to life, and you are human, and You need others to recognize that. You need others to recognize the fact that what are your basic needs? You know, you need to eat, you need to drink, you need to be heard, to be, you know, that's your humanity. And I think that you know, there have been, you know, many examples that have shown that a child who is not, or a baby who doesn't get affection when they're born, may have the nourishment in terms of food and water that they need, but they don't have affection. They die quicker than the child who may be undernourished at first, but has the love and affection and attention that is required of, you know, to as humans. We're social creatures, and that is part of our makeup. It's as important as breathing, as eating, as water, and I think that that's forgotten. It's been forgotten in this world of this extremely fast-paced world that we live in, and I think that really needs to not only, we may think that it's obvious, but it's not in the constructs, and even in the funding constructs of the world going forward. The importance of taking a pause and going back to that important necessity of feeling part of the global constructs as we move forward, rather.
Beautifully put, thank you. Maybe we'll give the last question to Pat.
Oh, thank you so much, Elliot. I came into the room a little bit late, I'm afraid, but it has been most inspiring. Thank you, Helene, so much for what you've had to say. And really, the question is very simple, and I apologize if you perhaps have answered it in your talk before. Is there any particular philosopher or philosophy or philosophies that have inspired you in the way that you think about life and what has influenced your way of working? I've been following a lot of philosophical arguments recently, and I'd love to hear if you have an answer to that question. Thank you very much. And
you're welcome. And I think I have two answers to that. One is that I think it's a combination of the many philosophies and cultures that I've encountered across the world in different communities that have really kind of intertwined to get me to where I am. I think I've taken a little bit of everywhere, a little bit of everybody, a little bit of every culture, language, religion, philosophy that I've encountered, way of life, I think, to create my own kind of global vision and perception. So that's one answer to it. The other one that I think is very important to me particularly is the fundamental values that you learn through martial arts, and the importance. I wish that there was a lot more of martial arts type of value-based society, because martial arts bring to the roots of respect, of dignity, of, you know, self-preservation through the capacity of learning how to, you know, to defend yourself, but not in the constructs of violence, but more in the constructs of learning the protection of your own humanity, and at the same time understanding the core values of respect and dignity that are needed to move us forward. Therefore, knowing how to also address aggressivity, conflict, and using it actually as a tool for conflict resolution. And I think the fundamental values that are taught in martial arts are extremely important. And we're seeing it used more and more in the different peace building constructs. And I'm not just talking about martial arts, just in terms of the sports. I'm also talking about the constructs around that, the meditation and yoga, and the combination of those that I think are extremely important. And I've seen the children who grow up with those values, who learn it through different practices of martial arts. You know, myself, I've done this with my child since he's very little in Taekwondo. I saw my brother evolve through judo. I saw martial arts instruction being used in conflict zones and situations with the youth, and that is extremely powerful in terms of being able to address some of the, the core basic principles that, if they're not addressed, can lead to conflict. So I hope that helps.
That is extraordinary. Thank you so much. It's another dimension to add to my curious into all of this. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Pat. And yeah, definitely double click on all that, Helen. As you know, I've always felt martial arts have the potential for empowerment, and it brings a very practical philosophy into any space, and really allows for the kind of ethic of might for right, which you really embody. So wanted to thank you so much. It was really wonderful. I've gotten a number of messages from folks who found this quite enriching, myself included, and I think you are a wonderful example of the spirit that you spoke to, of really just caring for people. And it's incredible to hear how hard you work and have worked, but it feels like where you get that fuel is that real love of people that you embody. And so really want to honor that and share my and our appreciation. It's been wonderful time. I appreciate you taking the extra time to be with us today. And is there any way folks can be of service or support for those who might be so inclined?
I think that participating in these kinds of areas, and I think whatever we can all take from these kinds of lessons and then share them forward, I think is extremely important. And maybe brainstorming on ways to bring kind of these ideas and these stories, and not just mine, but into a more global space, I think would be helpful in terms of brainstorming on how we can truly leverage lessons learned. Where a lot of people have lived in different contexts and different constructs, and I think those stories, I think, can help move us forward. And oftentimes there is just not enough space right now, as Kate was mentioning earlier, to be able to share the lessons learned. And I think lessons learned are actually not shared sufficiently in terms of then the next steps in decision-making processes in our own lives, but also in big organizations. And I think that needs to change. So, if you have any spaces or any ideas or ways to enable me to, I think, share this further and wider, or bring in more people to share, I think, so that we use some of these lessons to move forward. I think that's great.
Much, Helen. Please go ahead.
There's one more, actually, that I was talking specifically about the work that needs to be done to evolve on gender-based violence solutions in the 21st century and the 21st century construct, when we're talking about the challenges that borders represent in terms of laws. And as you know, I am also working on developing a foundation specifically to have a legal fund that is accessible to victims of violence around the world, and legal advice that can help people address the loopholes in which they fall into as soon as we are dealing with any type of international context, nationalities, diverse nationalities, and so on and so forth, or living in a country that is not your own when you become victim of this, or there's so many different constructs that are actually much more common than we think. And so I am developing a foundation to address this, as well as create a new educational type of network and media and global engagement on this, and a policy arm. And I think there are actually solutions that can be moved forward in not too complicated a way. So if there's anybody interested as well in knowing more about this, or who has ideas of other people that could support this kind of initiative. And obviously then I'm looking at the funding aspects as well. I think that would be very very useful. So that's it for now.
Right on. So anyone who is, I guess, coming from either a funding or perhaps legal insight perspective on that side of things, if you could reach out to Helen or myself, and I'll pass you on. That would be great. So one more time, thank you, Helen, and thank you everyone for coming. This new System Changer Spotlight Room, we're going to be running a few times a month, and taking the opportunity to feature, as I've put it before, so many of us have been really inspired by all the change makers we've found, but then we come across folks who just really stick out because of their work and the impact that they've made, and Helen was definitely one of those bright lights, and so we're going to be featuring a few more of those. Tomorrow we've got Changemakers United. Saturday we run Society OS, and all of this under the Global Unity Club. So if you want to follow it, hit the greenhouse at the top or head to globalunity.org. If you want to add yourself to the Changemakers United database and be updated as it develops, you can head to my Twitter account. The pinned tweet has a link our friend Benjamin Life set up where you can add yourself and any information on your movement or project that you like. And with that, I want to again say thank you, Helen. It was really a pleasure getting to hear more of your incredible work and story, and just want to encourage you to keep doing this incredible work that you are doing, and can't wait to see how that work evolves over the next many years. So thank you again, everyone, and we'll
Thank you. Thank
please.
you, Elliot, as well. For the amazing work that you're developing and the thinking around these global change makers. I think that this, it's the beginning of something that can really, really create impact. And I think everybody here has something to bring to the table. I wish we could hear more from them. And I think there's an opportunity to do that later. There's several of you with whom I've connected offline, and I look forward to engaging in further conversations, because I'm sure everybody has a particular story, a special experience that is equally as valuable as mine, and by sharing, I think that's how we move forward. So thank you so much for what you've done, Elliot.
Thank you. I see folks in the room who kind of have their specialties within, whether it be communications and film or working on areas around gender-based violence, and so there are these overlapping areas and specialties that we just need to bring together, kind of to Eric's question. So, but we could certainly go on, and we will let you get some dinner and enjoy the rest of your night after a long day. But thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day and week, and hopefully we will all connect soon.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Great room. Bye-bye.